When Keir Starmer says, I'm prepared to be unpopular, great, but do something that really pisses somebody off that takes the country forward. Don't just piss everybody off generally. Piss somebody off because you're doing something that takes the country forward.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we've seen a train barreling down the tracks, coming right at our faces. And then at the last second, we're caught like deer in the headlights. The light is shining in my face. I should run, but instead it just clobbers me and knocks me over. And that is what has happened in Britain and then in the United States as Neopopulism, Brexit, Trump, reform, and maybe now tariffs, deportations, and the weaponization of anti-immigrant sentiment has all been just barreling down at us, and no one has been able to dodge it. We've seen the train coming for years, and yet we haven't dodged it. To help me unpack why this is the case, the absolute mess we're in, what shenanigans got us here, I am joined by both halves of The Two Matts, which is a lovely podcast that we're going to put a link to in the show notes. The first half of The Two Matts is Matt Kelly, the founder of The New European, and Matt D'Ancona, the editor-in-large of The New European. Welcome, welcome.
Hello, Jason. Nice to be here.
Good to see you.
So in the analogy that I casted, whether it's the liberal elite or Podcastistan or center-left politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, we can't use as the excuse, oh, we didn't see it coming, or we didn't know that this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment would resonate with people in this way. We have seen this thing coming for 8.5 years now. What possible excuse could there be to not have adopted more radical proposals, either economically or ideologically or in the media?
Well, I think abject complacency has been the theme of the 21st century so far. And I think if there's a silver lining to this very dark, oppressive cloud that's just appeared on the horizon, it's that has been completely cracked open now. And there's no illusion anymore, no delusion anymore that we are in an existential battle for what we see as a progressive future for, these sentiments almost sound Trumpian, but a progressive future for Western civilization. We are really at a crossroads.
Of course, complacency, but I'm trying to push a little bit here. We in the establishment and in the chattering classes must bear some kind of responsibility, but I put it up with our leaders and media professionals even more. What is it about Hillary and Kamala and their campaigns and Jake Sullivan and Huma Abedin that they were unable to come up with a compelling offering when now they're fully aware of the nature of the challenge? What do you think, Matt D'Ancona?
Well, I think that there was a supposition that there would be at some point a return to normality. The grown-ups would come back, that people really wanted boring politics back. Neither of us believe that for a moment, and were concerned that there are underlying causes to all of the populist uprisings around the world, of which this Trump second victory is much the most spectacular, that were simply ignored by those who were seeking to displace it. And unfortunately, it does involve some really deep dive thinking about what can be done to reach the voters who feel, they wanted Trump back, knowing absolutely what he is and what he represents and the kind of government that he was likely to lead and is now putting in place. Now that's a global message. That's not just a domestic American message.
However, I think that there is something starkly contrasting between the British and American characters and what part of neopopulism attracts them. We learned from this election that Americans, enough of them, are attracted by deviance. In other words, they didn't vote for Trump in spite of the fact that he's a racist who tried to overthrow the government. They voted for him because of it. They love the lies. They want to screw the enemy. They are zero-sum, us versus them. And the more genteel British neopopulists were not attracted by the fact that Boris Johnson lied to Parliament and had a party during lockdown rules. And I think that that contrast is very, very important. How do you see it?
I don't really agree with your reading of that, to be honest. I think the idea of a violent reaction against the status quo, I'm sure that's true. But I also think there's a large constituency of people who are thrill seekers in politics now in the way they vote. They want to be excited. They want to see action. They want to be entertained, and that's what you see Johnson, Trump, Farage, you see them as entertainers and they think, the hell with it, let's see what that guy does. And so I think that's part of it. I also think that the idea that the British public were more condemnatory of Boris Johnson than the American public have been of Trump, I don't think that that's true either. I think if they were, it was very transitory. And I think a big majority of conservative voters in the UK would welcome back Boris Johnson tomorrow.
Why couldn't we be entertaining on the left? I mean, Kamala had Joy and we have Beyonce. Why was Oprah Winfrey and Taylor Swift not able to be more entertaining?
Because, first of all, joy about what? You're addressing a public that is angry about the way things are going. And saying it's a brat summer and I'm bringing back the joy speaks to no one in that context. And also the parading of celebrities, I think, is very out of date actually now. It was obvious occasionally when she was allowed to speak as a human being that she was an appealing and presidential character. People said, oh, she couldn't have managed 3 hours with Joe Rogan. She absolutely could have, but there was a kind of reticence about it. And I think that that's really important, is that people who can speak human even if they do so in a kind of flamboyant fashion like Trump or Boris Johnson, are the new normal. And the kind of message discipline and the very theatrical, choreographed convention she ran, that's old politics.
No, I couldn't agree more. Kamala wasn't allowed to go off-piste at all in making big pronouncements. And if you saw her on Dana Bash, she could never explain why she had changed her positions. Like, now I support fracking in Pennsylvania. No explanation, because everything had to be focus grouped to death. And this is the problem with the liberal establishment, for sure. But I still want to go back to British-American differences. There are some, right? I think that deviance, cutting the queue, is not popular in England. But screwing the little man to get ahead, and I didn't pay the contractors, that apparently is popular in the US. And I just want to explore the fact that Americans feel that we had a hyperpower moment. We didn't jam it down the throats of our adversaries. We were too nice. And I don't think that that's a British sentiment right now.
If I could characterize Britain's mindset now, it's one of an utter lack of self-confidence. It's like an individual that's been so beaten up and suffered so much bad luck that it feels like nothing can go right for it, and it's a worthless person. And I think that stretches back 60, 70, 80 years, to be honest. I think since the sort of the collapse of empire. And I think Matt and I were both kind of excited when Keir Starmer started talking about missions, and a mission-led government. And the only problem is we don't know what the bloody mission is, and we don't know where it ends up. That's what I would say is the key difference between American vision right now, American populism right now, and British politics right now, is that whatever you say about Donald Trump, the core mantra is about high ambition. Whereas we've got fix the foundations, right?
Yes, and this is why neopopulism is so popular. It has a mission statement which can be encapsulated in one sentence and understood by everyone, and it's one that makes you feel good about your country. You want to make America great again because America was once great, and if you're a Farageist, you want to get rid of the immigrants because the British spirit is something which is glorious and can be unbounded. It is a huge mistake that on our side, we haven't been able to make a mission about liberal values and the market economy and the free press and whatever that is compelling. I guess it would have to be slightly more nuanced, but I still think it could be simple enough to engage people. And this is why I think I'm no longer on the center left. I'm in the center because I believe that America and Britain and Anglo-European visions are good. I stand for our history and its great cultural productions. And apparently, the leaders that have tried to oppose this neopopulism are unable to articulate what that is and what they're standing for, and that doesn't work.
I think there's a trepidation amongst the left. There's always been a trepidation amongst the left about saying things in an impactful way. You know, everything's caveated, everything's muted, everything's put through a committee. And in the UK now, you're seeing a man in Keir Starmer desperately trying to please everybody and pleasing nobody. You know, he's trying to keep the red wall on side by saying we'll make Brexit work. And in doing so, he's infuriating the Rejoin Brigade, which are swelling in number. You know, he's talking about smashing the gangs, which sounds eerily reminiscent of Stop the Boats. And he's not pleasing anybody with a real intelligent liberal fronting communication about how to make immigration work in this country. And I just think that saying it straight is a very simple antidote to other people who are saying it straight.
Not just saying it straight, but acting boldly. You
absolutely.
Pointed out on your podcast that there's an open goal for Starmer about getting close to the EU. It could be youth mobility to start, but it could even be fully rejoining the customs union. But because he boxed himself out in the manifesto pledges, it's more difficult. But what I would do is be like, so what? The manifesto pledges don't actually bind me. That's not how British government works. Boom. Now that there's this threat of Trump, we've got to do it so that we can have joint defense with the EU. And we're, now starting these negotiations because this is going to bring in 10 to 20 billion a year or whatever. And this is also the same with the Biden brigade. They were willing to defend Ukraine, but not enough to make it win. They were willing to constrain Israel, but not enough to make Israel not do human rights violations. And there isn't the boldness. And I think that this is something I want to get at from Brits who I think have been experiencing this for longer. Blair was bold. He was center-left and bold. When did bold end? Why can't we do bold anymore?
For some reason, I think partly intellectual laziness, technocracy has returned with a vengeance. And what's interesting, I think, is I don't think consistency is actually what the voters care about. What they care about is, are the people in charge addressing the real questions at the moment? So you take Thatcher. Why was Thatcher successful? She caused a lot of damage, but she also understood that the main questions of the hour was, how do you get the British economy back on side? How do you deal with the power of the unions? How do you deal with the Cold War? Blair comes along and realizes that the British public are asking different questions by the mid-1990s, which is, this has been pretty exhausting, the endless savagery of Thatcherism. Can we have some social justice alongside our competent economics? He completely understands that. And he delivers it in a very bold, and he's running far ahead of his party. And he wins 3 parliamentary majorities in spite of Iraq. We don't have anything like that on the left of centre at the moment. And that's really worrying because the questions at the moment, here we are at the end of 2024, are enormous. Climate change, pandemic resilience, inequality, future of healthcare, the future of social care, intergenerational problems, housing. I mean, I could go on, which are just not being addressed.
And in terms of the path ahead for neopopulism in the States, why don't we contrast what can be learned from the British example from what can be learned from the Hungarian or the Israeli examples? I wrote in 2015 that the American future might be Hungary and Orban, and that we needed to look and see what structural factors had led the appeal of neopopulism, take back control, and then dole out corrupt contracts to your buddies. What had brought that about? So I was wondering if maybe you could walk us through how you see the Hungary example, the Britain example and the Bibi Netanyahu example, and what that could say about the future trajectory of America?
I think there's a problem which is common to all of these places, which is that there's an asymmetry between the context populists need to thrive in and the context that progressives need to thrive in, which is that populists, as you said, are all about offering simple answers to complex problems and about identifying threats, whether it's immigrants or the deep state or the fake news or whatever it might be. Progressives, on the other hand, actually want to make life better for people, which is a lot harder. And the thread that binds all of these places is a sense that the system just isn't delivering. The system doesn't work. And that generates cynicism, makes people think that no one is telling the truth, which always helps the right more than the left. And what we're not seeing are people coming up with policy programs that are sold in a way that people can understand and then see working. And people understand it. These things don't come overnight. But I think that the gap between government and people at the moment is dangerously large. And it's so easily filled by Trumps and Farages and Orbans and so on.
Yeah, I'd just add to that I think it's impossible to exaggerate the importance of communication in this and communication style. And the last guy, I think, in the UK who had it was Blair, who had that ability to absolutely shut down people in an aggressive way. And if people haven't seen the clip of Blair versus Nigel Farage in the European Commission, it's well worth look it up on YouTube.
We'll put the link in the show notes.
Yeah, because Farage starts yelling this hectoring stuff about coming to close down the European Union and that. And Blair absolutely decimates him. I mean, he destroys him. And people like Farage, under that kind of fire, wither and walk away. And the counterpoint to that was a moment in time that I look back on and cringe at is Barack Obama at the Washington Press Club dinner humiliating Donald Trump from the stage and mocking him. And I thought, if you're looking to destroy someone, you can't just mock them. You've got to destroy them with absolute argument. And Trump rose to that moment, whatever you think, and he thought, I'll show you, pal.
I want to go back to my analogy, and I'm going to go through Hungary, Israel, Britain, and what I learned from them. So in Hungary, what we can learn is that people hate gay marriage much more than they like having slightly better economic growth or technocracy, and that the culture wars stuff, which is unbelievably successful, and it is similarly successful in the United States. And that on the center and center left, if we don't come up with answers to that, if we don't move our own politics culturally, we're going to be in trouble because it's a losing issue, essentially, when the right is setting those culture war issues. And now if we move on to Israel, it's the question of nationalism and us versus them. I wrote an article for you guys at the New European a couple of weeks ago that I'll put a link to in the show notes about conspiracy theories, and that the meaning of Bill Gates implants a microchip through the vaccine, and Soros does this, and there's a pedophile ring run out of a pizza parlor. The meta meaning is an us versus them. And what we've seen is that when things were close to peace before Rabin was killed, that us versus them was breaking down, and the left could be strong and could make peace and deliver economic growth and all of that in Israel. But once there's a conflict and people are dying and there are Hamas bombs and whatever, people go back to the us versus them, and you have just complete right-wing dominance. And if what Netanyahu has done is use this conflict to bring the Israeli public back to an us versus them. And Trump is making a range of conflicts with, it was Mexico before, it might be China now, and then Americans are going to be into this us versus them. And that's very, very, very worrying, because the Americans are a patriotic people, and the us versus them is a winning argument for the right. And what I learned from Britain is that the right has understood, the neopopulist right, that some issues are just so complicated that by putting them out there in the public, it's a spanner in the works of government and the media and the society. Brexit didn't just break Britain, it broke the whole media environment's ability to discuss anything so that it's not possible to formulate policy. And it might be that in the US case, that's something like the immigration debate, that how to build the wall or do whatever just literally breaks the ability for us to make any coherent policy. What say you, Matt?
Well, one thing I think learning from the American campaign, and it wasn't pleasant, but I noted this, how successful Trump's anti-trans ads were. And I think that there's a lesson in that, which is that what it spoke to was this idea that liberal left elites decide their position on an issue and then simply impose it through institutional vectors. But I think that that's why culture wars in all sorts of locations and in different countries continue to be a problem, because there is undoubtedly, it is just the case that on the left of center, there are a series of beliefs about a series of issues which are settled, but are not necessarily the views of the majority. And whatever happened to persuasion? Whatever happened to debate? The idea that, cancellation and censorship and taking people off social media platforms, the answer, that's always the response. It's crazy.
That's such a great point. And one thing that I've learned to overcome during my experience with the New European is, journalists have an inbuilt reluctance to offend. We're taught, especially in print, because your audience dwindling at an alarming rate. So the mantra is don't scare the horses, don't do anything to upset the readers, And I've learned that if you want to succeed, the reverse is true. You have to be prepared to scare horses. You have to be prepared to upset people. And you have to develop the ability not to care. But these days, I think as a journalist, and I would suggest as a politician as well, you have to, when Keir Starmer says, I'm prepared to be unpopular, great, but do something that really pisses somebody off, that takes the country forward. Don't just piss everybody off generally. Piss somebody off because you're doing something that takes the country forward. I define myself and my readers by who hates us as much as who loves us. And that I think is something we've got to live with now. If we think there's some panacea that's going to produce a happy nation in the future, I think we're insane. But what's really important is that we act with sanity in government, that we're rational in government, and that we do things that make sense for the country and not just sense in some media world, fantasy world where everyone's trying to make everybody happy. It's never going to happen.
After the break, the two Matts and I return to our discussion of this mad, 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 mad world. I could see a situation that because neopopulism doesn't deliver any solutions and, the tariffs cause horrible inflation, much worse than we've had now, and the economy tanks or whatever, there is some hope, no?
Well, I guess in the American context, you could say, let's look at the mass deportation program. Now, I would guess the American public as a whole won't recoil from genuinely criminal, gang members and so on being deported post-haste. I don't think that's a vote loser. But if Stephen Miller gets his way and individuals are torn out of their communities where they've lived for a long time and families are broken up, I wonder how the American public actually would respond to that spectacle on its television screens every day.
Of course. And then who's going to do your lawn care? And if in 2027 you have to spend $20 an hour to get lawn care done, there'll be a revolution.
You're absolutely right to cite the lawn care and the child care and this is where industries get hurt. Hospitality industry in the UK is really struggling because we can't get the waiters and the waiting staff and the kitchen staff. Fruit picking in the summer is really, really hurt in the UK because we haven't got the guys coming in on a temporary basis to pick fruit, make a few quid, go home.
Social
care is absolutely getting battered because people are short-staffed in care homes right across the NHS. The health service, we're completely short-staffed. So you can either argue, okay, we've got to breed a whole new wave of skills, by the way, in a population that's in decline. Or you can say, let's make this a welcoming place for immigration to come in and grow the economy. Here's where the growth will come. This is the solution to the problem. And that's the argument that I'm so disappointed that Labour have not been making to date. Instead, they've been pandering to this narrative that we can do it all ourselves and the economy will just magically grow.
And you'd think Keir would be well positioned to do so because he has such a stonking majority and because he's a white man whose father was a toolmaker. And as a result, in theory, he should have the cultural capital as a white heterosexual man from the quote-unquote working classes to make the argument. It's become fashionable to dump on him, but I wonder if this is because the media in this country is so biased and able to just shoot down any impulse towards sane solutions.
I hear that, but all that was true during the Blair era. And he won 2 landslides and 1 big parliamentary majority in a row. I'm not sure, actually, that Keir Starmer has an idea of the future that is more than settling the boat a bit. There's too much backward-looking blaming of the Conservatives. Of course, you do that at the start, fine. But there's also a trope that Matt and I have noticed and are alarmed by, which many senior members of the government use, which is to say at the end of speeches, and if you don't like what I'm offering, you come up with something better. Well, that's not the voice of a confident government. That's a very defensive position.
They're almost fighting the next election now. But what I think is clear is that if they govern in defense mode, they will get torn to shreds in 4 years' time.
And Kamala is the proof of that because essentially her message was, I'm not Trump. And the thing that she did best was the prosecution of the debate where she made him look like a clown who responds to flattery and all of the illegal felonious stuff he's done. But she couldn't put forth her vision. And Keir is the same prosecutor that Kamala is. And Keir did a very good job showing the corruption of the Tories. But then he comes into office. He's caught with these football tickets and the other micro scandals, all of which are micro compared to Tory scandals. But he's not able to put forward more positive messaging. And that's a connection, what goes back to the complacency of the left in general. And some people say that this would also tie it into the Hungarian and Israeli cases, that after Rabin was killed, no one had anything to offer. If you looked at the Amram Mitznaz and other Israeli left politicians, they couldn't say, this is how we are going to get the settlers out and we're going to make peace with the Arabs and we're going to deal with the Emiratis. And in Hungary, the left was bickering between former socialists, market capitalists, ones who want to be part of the Visegrad bloc. They couldn't put forward a unified position.
Well, I think that one of the things that modern politicians full stop have to understand, and Trump did, is that the electorate is spectacularly volatile. There used to be these great cycles and pendulum swings, and not anymore. So you've got that problem, and you've also got the greater problem that the most kinetic politician on the British scene is Farage. Nigel Farage is the only leader of a party, really, at the moment, who is making gains, who is making noise, who has an aura of energy around him. And I can easily see some sort of electoral pact between the Conservatives and Reform in the next general election that could be a real problem for Labour. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it is a prospect.
So, to wrap up the episode, I'm just going to ask 1 or 2 lightning round questions. Any silver linings?
It's going to be good for newspaper sales. There's going to be plenty to write about. It's going to be interesting. But to circle back to my opening point it is a moment of enormous clarification. If you don't get it now, you never will.
I'd echo that. I think that the only thing that's good that can come out of this is if it acts as a real bucket of cold water in the face.
So no particular policy silver lining like, oh, China will be weakened, or possibly whatever travesty the Israelis will do will have to be over by a certain point because Trump doesn't like wars or something like that. You don't see a particular policy?
All I see is potential catastrophes, the biggest being for Ukraine. Honestly, the complexity of the Middle East is beyond rune reading, I think. And all I see is a lot of people suffering in the next 4 years. And I'm being most mindful of people being deported from the US, people who've lived there for many years, have families there, who are, to all intents and purposes, American citizens. I think there's going to be a great tragedy on a human level, but also a great tragedy to think that the nation that has that Statue of Liberty on the Hudson River is the nation that's going to renege on that spirit, is to me a bigger human tragedy.
There are no silver linings for me. It's a personal tragedy, even though I prepared for it by getting my UK Global Talent visa and buying my house and burrowing underneath the hills of Hampstead to find refuge. There are no silver linings because the moral tragedy and having to look at my fellow Americans who voted for this is something that is humiliating and embarrassing and a tragedy. And then to think of the hundreds of thousands who will lose their homes in the Donbass and maybe even southern Ukraine, and the millions who may die in the Middle East, and the millions who may be deported in Hispanic communities in America, and then to think that my countrymen are somehow complicit in this and have become good Germans, it's too much for me to bear emotionally. I wake up at 4 a.m. at night tossing and turning over it because I think it is to some extent on us. So this is the next lightning round question. Point a finger at someone on our side, as it were, in the classical liberal or center-left who they fucked up and they're part of the reason that we're in this mess. Name and shame, please.
Well, I think Joe Biden fucked up. He should have stuck to his initial promise to be a bridge and to serve as a one-term president.
I think George Clooney fucked up. I think he represented everything that anybody who was wavering on whether Donald Trump was going to be the antidote to an elite liberal hierarchy in the United States would look at Clooney's interference and say, fuck that guy,
Okay. Why don't you guys close by telling the listeners about your favorite article of, say, the last month or so, or of what you think the New European can add to this debate, and we will put a link in the show notes for people to subscribe to the New European.
From my point of view, my fellow Matt has been superb in covering the election and the recent aftermath, and has been worth the entrance price alone. So perhaps I would nominate one of Matt's articles, maybe about the wolves in the White House.
Yeah, and I direct people to James Ball's coverage of the election in the States and in the UK, because James is actually has written what I think is by far and away the better book about QAnon, and he understands technology and conspiracy theories very, very well and their role in hypermodern politics. So he's been on an absolute tear recently.
This was very enjoyable, albeit tragic, because there are not so many silver linings. And I look forward to hearing more from you guys. My dear listeners, my mega orderers, I know we all need a group hug. I hope my discussion with the two Matts has not brought you down too much. I am feeling very, very low these days. I want to give you the mega ordering vibe. We hope that you subscribe to the Substack, which is free, and we're going to share more information about the New European, some of the two Matts' recent episodes, and I will reshare my article on conspiracy theories in the New European. Our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. I am no longer wishing you an orderly week because we know it's not going to be orderly. I wish you as much happiness and joy in the regular things in life as you can find in them. And I hope that listening to our podcast is something that brings a little bit of joy in these very sad, very down, very disordered times. Until next week.